Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to do a video over the 25 most important events in history. These lists are always pretty interesting to me because I'm curious kind of what other people see as important or, good or bad historically, things like that. So this is one I'm curious to see kind of what they go to as far as what was important historically. I feel like this would be an incredibly hard list to make, so I'm going to cut them a little bit of slack if I don't agree on some stuff, but let's go ahead and get into it.
Mapping the most important events in history is a daunting task. With all that has happened over the course of 5,000 years of human history, how, you might be asking, can we dwindle it down to 25 things? Obviously, there were plenty of other events that occurred which had wide-ranging consequences. Out of all the kings, rulers, leaders, assassins, wars, and innovations changing the progress of mankind, what were some of the most consequential that reverberated throughout the world? That's what we're here to discover. So, ready to hop into a time machine and travel back in time? I'm Mike with List 25, and here are 25 most important events in history. 25. Greco-Persian Wars. It might not seem like it, but the Greco-Persian Wars were a huge turning point in human history. If the Greeks had fallen and lost against the Persian Empire, like everyone else in the known world...
Yeah, I probably agree with this one. The Greeks and the Romans have huge reverberations throughout history on a lot of different societies, certainly the modern Western world. We talk about this on Discord some, about how much of the Western world is essentially placed on top of what was the legacy of the Greeks and Romans. There's words and there's political things and there's a lot. So yeah, I probably agree with this one.
The Western world would likely not have the democratic politics, art, literature, and science it does today. The Greeks not only won against the Persians, but they thrived thereafter all the way up to Alexander the Great. 24. Alexander the Great. Speaking of Alexander the Great, when the Greek city-states were growing in their power, he rose up as a Macedonian ruler that would use his charm, cunning, and ruthlessness to conquer Persia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and some parts of India. Not only did he build a massive empire, but his influence on culture ushered in the Hellenistic period, a heavy mixture of Greek and Asian culture that would dominate the world for centuries.
Yeah, I think that was probably the biggest thing, was the Greeks had this thing where they just could not stop fighting each other. And so Greek culture kind of, it got over to Persia, but it wasn't as much of a back and forth as it would later become with the mixture of Persian and Hellenistic culture after Alexander the Great, right? And what was the reason for that? Well, probably because Alexander the Great finally got all of the Greeks on the same page. And actually, I take that back. He didn't even get all the Greeks on the same page, but got 95% of the Greeks on the same page. And they could be dominant if they were on the same page. They just could never stop fighting each other.
23. Pax Romana. Pax Romana, which means Roman peace, was a period of peace and stability over the Roman Empire. It started at the reign of Caesar Augustus, when Rome had ruled Europe, North Africa, and Palestine, and lasted for 200 years afterward. This stability allowed for further advances in art, culture, and technology, and established much of what would become modern-day Germany, France, and England. 22.
Okay, so interestingly, especially with what it looks like the next one is going to be, I actually think that is one of the biggest influences on the Pax Romana, or the biggest influences that the Pax Romana had. It is my belief that Judaism that then has an offsect into Christianity, that it does not spread in the way that it spreads without the Roman Empire and the Pax Romana. It's particularly the kind of Roman infrastructure and safety and everything that went into being under Rome, right? That allowed Christianity to move further and further west. Well, it had a dominant impact on the Western world up to the modern day. And so that I can't even, in my mind, that's one of those things that's so incredibly important to what things look like in the modern day that I feel like it couldn't possibly be overstated. Like it's something that, at least in my opinion, drastically changed history to the point where things would look totally different. The historical time period and growth of the West would look totally different without it.
The life of Jesus. The life of Jesus was a major historical event which came about during the reign of Caesar Augustus in Pax Romana. Regardless if you believe Jesus' teachings, few deny how big an impact he left on human history and the massive religion that would soon follow. Christianity has impacted many elements throughout Western culture, shaping it for thousands of years to the modern day. With millions around the world worshiping Jesus as God, his influence has lasted far longer than most. 21. The life of Muhammad. Born in 570 CE, Muhammad was born in Mecca, and at the age of 40 he claimed to receive a vision from the angel Gabriel. He continued to receive these revelations, which became the Quran. His teachings and message drew crowds, but also swift opposition. He took his followers out of Mecca to Medina, but eventually would gather so many followers he'd return to conquer Mecca. As we know today, his impact on Middle Eastern culture and the world grew with the religion of Islam, becoming the second most popular religion in the world.
Yeah, again, in my mind, without the spread of because Judaism is kind of the rock to which the modern religions are tied, right? I just don't know how they spread and exist in the same way without Rome, without the Pax Romana, I feel like it made such a huge impact. And yeah, it makes sense that the modern religions would be on here because they obviously have had a big impact. But like I said, I feel like it all ties back to Rome in a way.
20. Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire.
Absolutely. This is one of the things that's interesting to me about how we talk about more modern terrible people, right? Because whenever things happened recently, you still have that like really raw emotion and vitriol and all that. Well, what the Mongols did was terrifying and awful to anybody, within a continent of them in any direction. But they are talked about today by historians in a way that references the things that happened that were good, that came out of it. The breaking down of the barrier between East and West, right? Because you had that huge divide there forever. You have this kind of culling or burning down of old civilizations and corruption and things of that nature. You have this massive kind of trade center spread across everywhere that they took over. It really changed things in a good way long term, but it was still terrible at the time, and that's kind of overlooked now, which is interesting that, the longer time goes on, the more we as people who study history kind of overlook the brutality of the time period.
Let's hop over to Asia now and look at Genghis Khan, the ruler of one of the largest empires in human history. Few would actually point to Khan as someone who radically changed history, but his Mongol Empire had sweeping effects in their time and beyond. First, the Mongolian army was a terror, conquering, slaughtering, and pillaging wherever they went. But they were also good at being pragmatic and including and adopting all cultures to please the masses and maintain control. By almost uniting Eurasia, they were able to spread technologies like paper, gunpowder, the compass, and even trousers.
19.
The Black Death. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, earned its name by spreading across Europe and leaving thousands of dead bodies in its wake. By the end, 75 million people are estimated to have died. Afterward, with a human shortage in Europe, serfs could now have their pick of who to work for, resulting in better conditions for them and their families. People were much more bitter towards the Catholic Church, and anti-Semitism grew, with many claiming the Jews started it in the first place.
18.
Yeah, that one's kind of self-explanatory, right? You can't have that many people die in kind of one singular event and it not be pretty drastically impactful on history.
The fall of Constantinople. Built by the Roman Emperor Constantine in 330 CE, Constantinople served as the Byzantine Empire's capital for centuries. Famous for its impervious walls, few thought it could actually be conquered. However, with the rise and spread of Islam, the capital eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. With the Ottoman Turks now having a foothold in Europe, the balance of power suddenly changed. Many Greeks converted to Islam or fled west. The conquest symbolized a victory for Islam, as they saw Constantinople as an affront for them.
17.
I'm a little bit... What do y'all think about that one? Because it's... The city itself, I feel like, is important, but I don't know if it's 25 most important. It was really more the encroachment to the West and to Europe in general that I feel like was the real kind of game changer there. And like I said, the fall of the city is a big deal. But if they take everything but the city from the Byzantines, is it like that devastating? I don't know. What do y'all think about that one?
The Renaissance. During the time of the Middle Ages and the Black Death, education and knowledge were relatively stagnant. But starting in the 15th century, there was a rebirth of knowledge, art, and culture that started in Italy and spread across Europe. This Renaissance, or rebirth, brought with it new technologies and advancements, which created more prosperity and wealth.
16.
The Gutenberg printing press. One of the greatest inventions of the Renaissance was the Gutenberg printing press. Gutenberg took the idea of printing from Asia, but made it much easier and more efficient with his press. The first books he printed were Bibles, and they were all sold before he even finished them. The printing press fanned the flames of reading, education, and knowledge with the new capability of mass printing books that would have previously been copied by hand.
15.
Yeah, so the Renaissance, the printing press, both a pretty big deal. You know, the expansion and growth of knowledge but I feel like it's not even really that. It's more the intellectual movement. Like the idea of knowledge being something that was sought after, something that could bring wealth. You have more stable societies, so that's something that's able to be done. It's kind of a big deal, but I almost feel like with the stable societies, it was going to be inevitable. That just tends to be what happens historically, which is why you see such a lapse there after the fall of the Roman Empire. You know, you have this huge lull, and the reasoning for that, and for a lot of other countries and areas and regions, is when you have the stable society, you're able to do things that in unstable societies you don't have the luxury to do, right? But sure, Renaissance printing press especially, a huge deal.
15.
Protestant Reformation.
Absolutely. This is a huge one. because it so changes the dynamics of the Christian world. I mean, it so changes the dynamics.
Something else that came out of the Renaissance, with the help of the printing press, was the Protestant Reformation. Starting with Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which argued against the Pope's use of indulgences, the Reformation grew with others like John Calvin and Henry VIII questioning the Pope and the Catholic Church's authority. These grievances caused the Church to split into various denominations, such as the Lutheran Church and the Anglican Church. Both positives and negatives grew from this split.
Anglican, at least that's how I've heard it pronounced, the Anglican Church.
Including bloody persecutions on the one hand and strengthened universities, art, and education on the other.
14.
European colonial.
And massive wars. Massive wars. You know, you have these huge clashes between the Protestants and Catholics all across Europe. Forever. I mean, inter-country, you can see it all the way up to basically the modern day. Huge deal.
Roughly from the 1500s to 1960s, Europe expanded all across the globe. From the New World to Africa, India, and Asia, Europe created colonies on almost every continent on Earth. With colonialism came greater trade, which meant greater wealth for the Europeans and mostly slavery and impoverishment for everyone else. As time went on, many of the colonies sought independence, and after World War II, a devastated Europe began to lose control.
13.
American Revolution. The American Revolution of the 13 British colonies was a major shift in the status quo. Originally fought over taxation without representation, the revolution expanded into Enlightenment ideals and giving rights to all people. With the colonies beating back the English and winning the war, the Americans not only won a war for themselves, but for the entire world, inspiring many other countries to fight against the ruling classes.
12.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true. The American Revolution kind of helped spark the French Revolution. The big thing, though, is the modern day difference, right? If the U.S. doesn't exist, the modern day looks very, very different. Which means the last, 100 years or so look very, very different. So I feel like that's the big thing there.
12.
French Revolution. Inspired out of the American Revolution, the French Revolution changed France and Europe forever. What began as a protest against the French monarchy and the elite turned into a discourse of republicanism, human rights, and citizenship.
Yeah, that then turned into a discourse on, being a traitor to your class and disloyal and not revolutionary enough. The French Revolution is a weird, conflagration of a whole different weird mix and meeting of different things at the same time. You obviously have the issue with the extremely high bread prices, the high taxation. You have the three estates and all of the issues that come from that and the pushback against the nobility and the church. It's a whole bunch of things. It definitely does change Europe, though. Even if nothing came out of it but the Napoleonic Wars, it would have a huge impact on the future of Europe, because then you're looking at the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe, and so there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes out of this. So I probably agree it deserves to be on this list.
Unfortunately, it became bloody and violent, and rather than leading to the latter ideals, became entrenched in nationalism and dictatorship. While the revolution was messy, out of it came Enlightenment-based philosophy, which also reverberated around the world.
11.
The American Civil War. Many believe the American Civil War was a mere family matter which only impacted the United States. But in reality, it had wide-ranging effects across the globe. For many in Europe, the American Civil War was evidence of republicanism crumbling. America was a shining example of the experiment, and if it couldn't withstand and stay united, what hope was left? Thankfully, the North succeeded and reunited with the South, surprising many, but also proving Republican institutions can remain intact after a hard and bloody war. Also, with America making slavery illegal, the slave trade virtually collapsed, with other countries in the Americas like Cuba and Brazil also abolishing it. It's quite possible that if the North had not won, legalized slavery would have continued on into the modern day.
10.
Yeah, that is... I don't know if I've ever heard that opinion before. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say that they think, anybody that studies history, say that they think that slavery would have maintained legality to the modern day. Most every historian I've come across thinks it was dying out regardless pretty soon, even if the South had won the war. There was just too much external pressure. There was the South's economy was wholly dependent on trade, which means you have to have another side that's willing to trade with you. And the direction the other Western countries were going, most historians I've come across just don't think that that's plausible long term. So most think it would have died out even if the South had won the war within a decently short period of time, historically speaking. I would say the big thing for the Civil War was outside of the U.S. because it had its own different impacts in the U.S. But from a kind of global perspective, I would say a couple of things. It definitely changed the slavery discussion in places in South America, in areas around the U.S., right? It definitely did, because then the U.S. started putting pressure on them to also stop slavery. But the U.S. Civil War was looked at very much from a military perspective. It was studied. It had trench warfare, which was this like brand new thing. It had newer weapons. The Gatling gun is in there. You have these newer kind of technologies, and it was almost like a dress rehearsal for what eventually would become World War One, right? And even for the Franco-Prussian War. And so you have a lot of these European countries that are really, really looking at the U.S. Civil War, and the Elder von Moltke for Prussia, and then for Germany. He studies it voraciously, and he thinks he sees all these things like how important train schedules can be to get supplies and troops from one place to another. So I feel like in the grand scheme of things, yes, slavery, my opinion is it was going to die out relatively soon. The British had fully turned against it by this point, and they were going to kind of wear everybody out about it. And you just had this tilt in the West, kind of this tilt of thought process going against it. The southern U.S. was very different at that time in how they thought of slavery, almost in a religious sense. It was a weird and sort of different thing. But outside of that, I think militarily speaking is where it had some of its bigger impacts. All right, top 10.
Industrial Revolution. From the 18th and 19th centuries, something amazing came out of Britain. Before, manufacturing mostly came out of people's homes or at shops, but suddenly all that shifted to major factories with machines helping mass produce all kinds of textiles. It's called the Industrial Revolution, and it changed Britain, Europe, and America from mostly agrarian societies to urban and industrial. Out of it came major innovations like trains and automobiles. Even though it provided serious challenges for the poorer classes, it improved the lives of the middle class.
9.
The Medical Revolution.
Yeah, so these are, at least these first two, are much more broad things. Like the Industrial Revolution, although it's talked about as like a singular point in history, it's really not. It's, it's a broad spanning of time where you have a lot of this, push towards industrialization. We in a lot of ways have something similar with technology right now. This technological revolution where there's just constantly new and improved tech all the time. Um, Same sort of thing, right? It has huge impacts on the way we do things. Medical revolution, obviously, it changes everything. If you don't have all your kids dying at 6 months old, then you don't have to have 18 children. Uh, Life expectancy goes up. It totally changes the way that things work across the board in every society.
Before the early parts of the 19th century, medicine was pretty much still in the Dark Ages. Some strides had been made, but it wasn't until the medical revolution that things began to change. It came out of the Industrial Revolution and the discovery that disease was caused by microorganisms. With the ability to mass produce new medicines in pill form and create anesthetics, healthcare took on a new form and would lead to some of the greatest discoveries in human history, like vaccinations and antibiotics.
8,
In fairness, it also came out with things like eugenics, but
Assassination of Archduke Ferdinand II.
for sure.
The Industrial Revolution changed a lot of things, but one major ramification was the growing sense of identity and nationalism. By 1914, with new technological innovations like tanks, machine guns, and deadly gases, Europe had become a powder keg of factions just waiting to go to war. So, on June
Tanks weren't created before World War One, or am I crazy? They weren't sitting on tanks waiting to roll them out when World War One started. That was something that came about from the issues of World War One, right? Am I losing my mind here?
28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, toured Sarajevo to inspect the armed forces in Bosnia, something Serbian nationalists weren't happy about. Ferdinand and his wife were shot by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist. The Serbian government was blamed for the attack, which sparked World War I.
Which they absolutely had a hand in, let's be honest. The Serbian government, maybe not in any official capacity all the way up to the top, but they definitely at some level had a hand in it. But yeah, World War One drastically changes everything going forward, so that's a pretty big deal.
7,
October Revolution. While many of Europe's revolutions saw changes toward republicanism, Russia's October Revolution, aka the Bolshevik Revolution, saw their politics moving in a totally different direction, towards communism. Led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks against the Tsar and his ruling class, the October Revolution was complete in 1917. Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown and executed, ushering in the Soviet era.
6,
I'm not sure if I could put the Bolshevik Revolution in front of World War One, when a very good argument could be made that the Bolshevik Revolution is directly caused by World War One. So I'm not, at least with the numbering there, I'm not totally sure about that.
Great Depression. With World War I over, the 1920s brought about rapid economic growth in the United States, but it all came to a screeching halt with the crash in 1929. Millions of investors' dollars were lost, banks had collapsed, and 15 million Americans were unemployed. This created a ripple effect across the globe, with almost every country seeing large-scale unemployment and deflation. It lasted a decade and resulted in major changes in the financial institutions, economic policy, and theory. While the United States and other countries began to see signs of a recovery by 1939, World War II gave it a final push.
Britain went almost completely opposite of the way that the U.S. handled it. Britain went with a tightening budget, lowering taxes, and I want to say they had their I believe it was their highest year over year economic growth in the 30s, but it may have been something else. They had some crazy stat of their economy in the 30s where I thought for forever that every economy in the 30s just sucked. It absolutely did not. Britain did fine for at least a stint of the 30s. The US absolutely did not. They struggled. But it for sure changed the way that, the US did banking, a huge change in banking. It changed all sorts of stuff, and it really probably changed the presidency. So yeah, pretty big deal, and it kind of puts the death nail in there being a World War II.
5,
World War II. While many thought World War I was over, deep roots of resentment and anger still existed in certain parts of Europe. With the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, the war started with the invasion of Poland in 1939 and continued as they began to advance on France and Belgium. The war included all parts of the world, such as the Soviet Union, China, and Japan. By the end of the war, millions of lives had been lost. Europe was a devastated wasteland, and new superpowers such as the Soviet Union and the United States rose up to create a new order and new conflicts.
4,
Cold War. With the end of World War II came a new type of war, the Cold War. The Soviet Union advanced on Eastern Europe, trying to spread communism, while the West held on to democracy, creating the Iron Curtain. With the threat of nuclear weapons wiping out millions in a matter of seconds, the Cold War was born, and would continue for decades, using a war of undercover intelligence, words, and diplomacy. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and Russia.
3,
One thing I will say is we absolutely got lucky in the early nuclear age. In the early nuclear age, when we didn't really know what the hell was going on or what these new weapons were capable of, what their side effects could be, we absolutely could have destroyed the Earth. And in fact, I would say going into it, the probability of us destroying the Earth in a very short time span was probably higher than us not. Think about it. We didn't know what capabilities or side effects were with these weapons, and yet we're using them, we're testing them. Like, and every time I look at stuff like that, I'm like, we got so damn lucky that we did not mess stuff up going forward forever.
3,
Sputnik. During the Cold War, new tensions rose with the Soviet Union launching Sputnik, the first satellite into space. It shocked the United States and sparked a space race between the two countries. The technological achievements created out of the space race included advanced weaponry, the ability for man to land on the moon, artificial limbs, water purifiers, and satellite TV.
2,
JFK assassination. President John F. Kennedy championed many efforts during his time as President of the United States, including softening tensions during the Cold War, advancing the space program, and fighting for civil rights. But with his assassination, much of his efforts were suddenly thrown into limbo. Luckily, his successor, President Lyndon Johnson, helped push forward his vision, and Johnson used JFK's legacy as a way to push Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act as well as fund NASA. Consequently, however, the biggest impact of the JFK assassination could arguably be the continuation of the Vietnam War. With his reluctance to put boots on the ground, many historians don't believe JFK would have heated up the war like LBJ. Without a Vietnam War, the world would have looked much different.
1,
Digital revolution. With the advancement of computers and the internet, the digital revolution has and continues to change the economic and information landscape. In many parts of the world, new businesses and jobs have grown out of the creation of the internet, but it's also provided challenges. With hackers stealing millions of dollars and identities, the mass spying from the NSA, and the use of false information to disrupt democracies, we certainly live in a brave new world.
Okay, so that was 25 most important events in history. The later ones, I feel like those weren't really that important. I mean, important for the U.S., I guess. But like in the broad scale of history, I don't know if I'd have had those in there. There probably would have been some different ones I'd have thrown in that weren't so modern. Um, for sure, I probably would have done that. But all in all, it wasn't a terrible list. Um, you know, the early ones I felt like were better. But anyway, as always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I'll put the link to the Discord down below, and I'll see you all next time.